The AP poll is out, and sadly, your Auburn Tigers just miss out on that number one spot. There are some good things to take away from this, though, and one of the things I want to do in this video is talk about how we actually got to the point where Auburn's already being considered potentially for that number one spot. What are the factors that were being decided on whether or not Auburn should be ranked number one versus someone else, and what it means for Auburn in college basketball going forward. Welcome to the E2C Network, where the Auburn family speaks. Our content here and on our podcast network may tend to be Auburn sports heavy, but if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so you never miss any content. And thank you to members of our booster club like Felix Gonzalez, who help produce videos like this. Even though I stress here on this channel all the time, again, rankings aren't all that important in the grand scheme of things, especially for college basketball. Just really fun to talk about, and there is a little bit of meaning there. There is something to this, which is why we're having this conversation right now. What I want to do for this video is maybe three things. Talk about how we got to this point. Crazy stuff happened in college basketball in this recent week or so. Number two, I'm going to talk about who the conversation was between to be number one, and number three, what it means for Auburn and college basketball going forward. So very briefly, let's start off with the first topic there and how we got to this point. It's been a crazy week, as I said, for college basketball, with a lot of the top 10 teams and just top 5 teams taking losses, which has resulted in what is now a big shakeup in the overall rankings, AP and college. So first of all, Baylor's been atop both of those. They took 2 losses in the last couple of weeks here, which is crazy to think about because they were undefeated at the time. Gonzaga has not taken any losses sitting at number 2, but they are now moving into the easy part of their schedule. UCLA lost, Auburn won a bunch of good games, USC lost, and that brings out the top 5. Now you've got Arizona and Purdue, who could probably make a case to move up as well, but they're really not in this conversation. It really was amongst those 4 teams, Baylor, Gonzaga, UCLA, and Auburn, and now with UCLA and Baylor losing, that eliminates them from this conversation, which is why we move into part 2 of our video here. Who really deserved to be number one? That's the title of this video. Was Auburn worthy of being number one when you compared it to Gonzaga? So in this section, I've actually identified 3 factors which we need to talk about to understand why this decision was ultimately made. And let's just be upfront, especially for us Auburn fans, it seemed like a pretty obvious choice, but I think it's fair to have an open-minded discussion about this to see if we agree with why these rankings fell out the way that they did. Let's start off with this current record and resume. Gonzaga was 14-2 on the year. Their signature wins were against number 5 Texas and number 2 UCLA at the time they played both of those teams. Their only 2 losses were also to ranked teams, number 5 Duke at the time, alongside number 16 Alabama. More on that in a second. Auburn's record currently is 16-1. The wins that they have that are signature wins, number 24 Alabama and number 16 LSU. Their only loss was to a ranked team as well, number 22 UConn at the time. Now, when you just look at it at face value and you look at just the overall records, Gonzaga's got 2 losses, Auburn's got 1. They've got 16 wins, they've got 14. Sure, you put Auburn at the front of the rankings at this point since they are the only ones now that haven't taken a loss in this past week. You probably can just end the discussion there, but this is a much deeper thought process the people who decide these things have to go through, so that's why we're having this conversation here. Look at the signature wins for Gonzaga. Very impressive. Number 5 Texas, number 2 UCLA. Auburn's still impressive, but arguably not as impressive. Can say the same thing for the losses as well. Auburn's sole loss in the year was to number 22 UConn at the time. They haven't really dropped off in a big way, but they're not as good as they once seemed at the first part of the season when Auburn did lose to them. The number 5 Duke loss and that number 16 Alabama loss does look a lot better comparatively for Gonzaga. So even though the record overall favors Auburn, you kind of have to look at it and break it down that way. And I could make a case it's very, very close where if this was the determining factor for who gets number one, Gonzaga takes this one just barely though. But our conversation is not done there. Let's talk about factor number 2 in this, strength of schedule. And this is where a lot of Auburn fans are harping on, and rightfully so, as to why Auburn should be considered number one. It's always been the case that Gonzaga has to play a very strong non-conference game because they're in a league that they usually dominate, and that, compared to some of the other conferences, isn't as competitive or challenging to get through. In fact, they're expected to win out the rest of the season, and if they do, they pretty much control their own destiny at this point. For Auburn, while they did have an easier non-conference schedule, it was pretty challenging as most of their teams they played were unranked, but they were all teams that were competitive last year or planning to be competitive this year in their conferences, maybe with one or two exceptions. We're going to look at the KenPom rankings for the strength of schedule and the ESPN ones as well. There's several others out there, but those are just the two that I chose to talk about here just because those are the first two that popped up. For Gonzaga, KenPom has their strength of schedule ranked at 182. Not good. ESPN is much better, but still not that great, 86 overall. So here you can see where their conference schedule is what really, really hurts them, even though they have played and had good results out of their very challenging non-conference schedule. For Auburn, their strength of schedule in KenPom is ranked number 18. Their ESPN ranking is 15. That's incredible consistency across these two respected rankings, showing that Auburn solidifies itself at the very least in the top 20 in terms of strength of schedule. It gets a little bit confusing for Gonzaga where you really should place them based off looking at these two. But if you try to average this thing out, you can at least make a case where everybody could probably get on the same page agreeing that they fall somewhere in the low 100 type of range for their strength of schedule if everybody got together in a room and talked about it. The point of this is Auburn throughout the entire season will play a more challenging schedule. So for that reason, in factor number 2, Auburn gets the nod. And so when we move on to factor 3, you're sitting at one favor for Gonzaga and one favor for Auburn. This is where the separator really is. And this is the one I think everybody anticipated, the common opponent. And that's the key part of this conversation. Auburn and Gonzaga have both played Alabama. The only thing better to fully solidify this conversation would be if they had both played them at Alabama or both played them at their home courts. But sadly, that is not the case, but is still a very large determining factor of who should be number one at this point in the season. The results for Auburn. Auburn fans, you know it. A win in Coleman Coliseum, 81-77, surviving a ferocious comeback by the Crimson Tide, trying to upset the Tigers in their bid for number one. For Gonzaga, though, not so fortunate and not so fortunate at home. They lose 82-91 to the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, when you guys say all this, don't hear me and think that Alabama's not a good team. I'm planning on them being, in fact, I'm hoping on them being a good team because it's better for our resume. So this isn't a bad loss. It's also not something that you want to happen to you at home. Auburn going on the road, to Coleman, surviving that comeback attempt is very impressive for them when you try to compare Auburn versus Gonzaga for the number one overall ranking. So for that reason alone is probably the best argument you can make for why Auburn should be number one. But when we look at all the three factors together, it makes a pretty compelling argument where this is a pretty close conversation, but somehow, some way, Gonzaga is still ranked number one. Some of this probably has to do with some pollsters who probably just don't see Auburn as that traditional power and have things a little bit skewed, or maybe didn't even do the research themselves. Probably won't name any of those out here, but that's probably the reason why Auburn did not end up at number one, even though they have a very, very compelling argument to be so. So what does this mean for Auburn basketball and college basketball going forward? Well, a couple things. Auburn basketball now sits at number 2, which means if they win out, they control their own destiny. Like I said, rankings really don't matter in the grand scheme of things at the end of the day for them, but it is nice to get to that point. We'd like to get there at some point. So if they win out, it'll take care of their business. Their schedule is far superior, so they can likely leapfrog Gonzaga by the end of the season. But Gonzaga is likely to win out themselves, and if they don't get challenged in a serious way, they can probably still have a case to stay at number one. Regardless of how it shakes out, whether Auburn gets to reach number one or not, this is a pretty awesome accomplishment for them to receive more first place votes than Gonzaga, but still being second. That's something that we can take hold of and be very proud of, that our program has reached the point where most of the pollsters believe that Auburn is the number one team. Just a few misguided individuals are causing the ruckus. Here's how I think stacking up the rest of the season. I do think Auburn's going to take at least 1 or 2 losses in the regular season, which will mean that they'll fall back a little bit, but then probably jump back up after they get back up on their feet. I don't foresee Gonzaga losing, but I don't know when all those things are going to occur. I have a feeling that Auburn's going to be able to jump Gonzaga pretty soon here. That's just kind of my gut feeling about it, but I don't know that we'll stay there. I do think we'll get to celebrate that moment, but it's probably coming at a later time. Auburn fans, I want to hear from you now in the comment section below. What do you think about being ranked number 2 overall, but still having the most first place votes out of both of these two teams? And if you're another college basketball fan, let me know your thoughts about this topic. What do you think Auburn should be ranked number 1 currently in college basketball? If you enjoy this type of content, please help support it by smashing that like button. And if you want more from us, be sure that you are subscribed along with hitting that notification bell so you don't miss any uploads or live streams. If you like some ways to help support our content here, check out the links in the description. You can join up as a channel member here by hitting that join button, or you can even go over to patreon.com/E2C Network to join our booster club. Both of those things start at $1 a month. Thank you for tuning into the E2C Network, where the Auburn family speaks. War Eagle.